Imagine a 14-year-old boy standing alone on a windswept dock as the entire town he once called home raises their hands in agreement not to welcome him, but to cast him out forever. They called him cursed. He called it freedom. This is the story of Eli Marsh, banished to the cold Atlantic coast, where he turned a lonely sea cave into a home and the ocean's bounty into his lifeline. You won't believe how one boy's exile became the making of a legend. The fog rolled in thick that November morning in 1923. The kind of fog that swallowed Harpswell whole and made the world feel smaller. Safer until it wasn't. Eli Marsh stood on the porch of the small gray house his father had built with salvaged ship timber, watching the harbor disappear inch by inch. He was 14, tall for his age, but still carrying the thin shoulders of a boy who hadn't quite grown into his grief. Inside, the house smelled of damp wool and the faint, lingering trace of his mother's chamomile tea. She had been gone 6 months now, taken by the tuberculosis that crept in quiet and left loud. Eli could still hear her coughs echoing down the hall at night, each one a little weaker than the last. His father, Thomas Marsh, had held her hand until the end, whispering promises about the spring cod run that would make everything better. Then, 3 weeks ago, Thomas had gone out in the dory alone and never come back. The boat washed up empty on the rocks below the lighthouse, oars still shipped, net neatly folded, no note, no body. Just the sea claiming what it wanted. Harpswell was a small place, 200 souls clinging to the rocky coast like barnacles. Fishing was everything cod, haddock, lobster in season. Superstition ran as deep as the currents. When the fish runs failed 2 summers in a row, when the winter storms tore roofs off houses, when 3 children died of fever in 1 month, people started looking for someone to blame. The Marshes had always been a little different. Thomas read books by lamplight instead of drinking at the tavern. Ellie's mother collected wildflowers and pressed them between pages of her old naturalist's guide, teaching Eli the names of every tide pool creature. They didn't go to church every Sunday. That was enough for whispers to start. The whispers became words after Thomas disappeared. Cursed blood. Someone muttered at the general store. The sea took him because he wasn't right with God. Another said the family had angered the old spirits of the coast by digging too many clams without offering thanks. By the time the town meeting was called, the idea had taken root like kelp in a storm. Eli stood at the back of the town hall that night, cap in hand, heart hammering. The room was packed. Lanterns flickering on weathered faces. Selectman Harlow, a broad man with a voice like gravel, stood at the front. "We've suffered enough," Harlow said. "The fish are gone. The storms are worse. We've lost good people, and now Thomas Marsh is taken. I don't pretend to understand the why of it, but the pattern is clear. The Marshes brought something dark with them. Eli is the last of them. We can't let it linger here." Voices rose. Some argued. Old Mrs. Perkins said the boy was harmless, just a child, but fear has a louder voice. Hands went up. Eli watched them rise one by one, like sails catching wind. His own hands stayed at his sides. No one asked him to speak. No one looked him in the eye. The vote was nearly unanimous. Banishment, not death. Harpswell wasn't that kind of place, but exile. He had until dawn to leave town limits. No supplies from the store. No goodbyes. Just go. Eli walked home through the fog alone. The house felt bigger, without his parents' voices. He packed what he could carry. A wool blanket, his mother's guidebook, the one with sketches of mussels and tide pools, a knife his father had sharpened on the back step, a tin of matches, and the last jar of her preserves. He left the rest. The house would stand empty. Maybe someone would take it. Maybe the sea would claim it. Dawn came gray and cold. Eli walked north along the coast path, away from the harbor lights, away from the only home he'd known. The wind cut through his coat. His boots slipped on wet rocks. He didn't cry, not then. Grief had burned too deep for tears. He just walked at he knew the cave. His father had shown it to him 2 summers earlier, during a low tide when the water pulled far back. "This is our secret place," Thomas had said, shining a lantern into the narrow opening. "Dry inside, high above the storm surge. The old ones used it for shelter when the Vikings came raiding. If ever you're lost, come here. Eli hadn't thought he'd need it so soon. The path narrowed, then disappeared into boulders. He climbed, hands raw from gripping granite, until he found the slit in the rock face. The opening was just wide enough for a boy to squeeze through. Inside, the air was still, warmer than outside, smelling of salt and ancient stone. The cave stretched back maybe 20 feet, ceiling high enough to stand. A narrow ledge of dry sand at the back stayed above the highest tide. Light filtered in from the entrance, turning the walls a soft green gray. Eli dropped his bundle and sat. For the first time since the vote, he let himself feel the weight. His chest ached. He pulled out the guidebook, opened it to the page his mother had marked with a dried seaweed ribbon tidal pools and their inhabitants, her handwriting in the margins. Observe, Eli. The sea gives if you watch, he whispered to the empty cave. I'm watching, Ma. That first night was long. He built a small fire near the entrance, using driftwood he'd gathered on the way. The smoke curled up and out, not filling the space. He ate the last of the preserves, blueberry, tart and sweet, and listened to the waves crash below. They sounded different here, muffled by stone, almost gentle. Morning came with a pale sun. Low tide revealed a world he hadn't noticed before. The rocks below the cave mouth were alive with mussels. Black shells clustered like grapes. Crabs scuttled in crevices. Small fish darted in shallow pools left behind by the receding water. Eli knelt, cold water soaking his knees, and watched. His mother's words came back. Never take more than you need. Leave some for tomorrow. He gathered a handful of mussels, enough for a meal. Back in the cave, he pried them open with his knife. Raw at first because the fire was low. They tasted of salt and iron, but they were food, real food. He felt a small spark of something, pride, maybe, or just stubbornness. Days blurred into a rhythm. Forage at low tide, collect driftwood, study the guidebook by firelight. He learned the moon's pull. How tides changed with the phases. He marked the wall with charcoal, 1 line for each day. The first week passed, then 2. He talked to himself sometimes, or to his parents. Ha, you were right about the cave. It's dry as a bone in here. Or, Ma, the Connors are hiding under the ledge today. Just like your drawing, the loneliness was the hardest part. Not the cold he could build a fire, not the hunger he could find enough. But the silence, no voices calling his name, no footsteps. On the porch, he missed the sound of the town waking up, the clatter of lobster traps, the laughter from the schoolyard he'd never go back to. One evening in late November, a storm rolled in from the northeast. Wind howled through the entrance. Like a living thing, Eli piled rocks to block most of the opening, leaving a small gap for smoke. Rain lashed the rocks outside. He wrapped himself in the blanket and waited. The cave held. The tide surged but didn't reach the back. When the storm passed at dawn, the world was washed clean. And Eli was still there. He had survived the first test. Winter settled over the coast like a heavy wool coat nobody asked for. By mid-December, the days were short, the sun barely scraping the horizon before slipping back into the gray Atlantic. Eli learned quickly that hunger had its own clock. One that didn't care about sunrise or sunset. It woke him before dawn. A hollow ache that started in his stomach and spread to his fingertips. He had grown thinner, his wrists sharper under the skin, but he was still moving. That was the victory. Every morning he waited for the tide to drop, then scrambled down the slick boulders to the mussel beds. The clusters were thickest near the low water line. Black shells glistening like wet coal. He pried them free with his knife, careful not to damage the rocks they clung to. His mother's book had a note in the margin. Mussels grow slow. Take gently, or next year there'll be none. Back in the cave, he built the fire higher now. Driftwood was plentiful after storms, but he had to dry it first, or the smoke would choke him. He learned to stack the wet pieces near the entrance where the draft would pull the moisture out when the mussels were clean. He roasted them on flat stones until the shells popped open with small hisses. The meat inside was sweet, almost buttery. When cooked right, he chewed slowly, making each one last. Fish were harder. The cunners and rock gunnel he'd seen in the tide pools were small, quick, and smart enough to stay under overhangs. Eli tried spearing them with a sharpened stick, but the water was too cold to stand in long, and his aim was terrible. After 3 frustrating mornings, he remembered something his father used to do on slow days, hand lining from the rocks. He unraveled a length of old fishing line he'd found tangled in the rack, tied on a bent pin from his mother's sewing kit as a hook, and baited it with a mussel. No rod. Just his hand wrapped in a scrap of cloth so the line wouldn't cut. He sat on a flat boulder that jutted into the water like a broken pier, legs dangling, line trailing down into the green-black depths. The first bite came fast, a sharp tug that nearly yanked him in. He pulled hard, hand over hand, and up came a cunner, fat and bronze, flapping wildly. Eli laughed out loud, the sound startling him. He hadn't laughed since the night of the vote. He clubbed the fish against the rock, cleaned it with quick, practiced cuts the way Thomas had taught him, and roasted it whole over the fire. The skin crackled, the flesh was white and delicate. He ate half and saved the rest wrapped in kelp. For tomorrow. That night he spoke to the fire. "Pa, I got one, just like you showed me. Didn't even need a proper hook." The flame snapped back as if nodding, but fish weren't enough forever. The cold was deepening, and the tide pools froze at the edges. Eli started exploring farther along the shore during low tide, looking for anything the sea might offer. One afternoon he found a small lobster caught in a crevice, undersized, maybe a pound, but alive and kicking. He carried it back carefully. In his cupped hands, feeling the spines against his palms, he boiled seawater in an old tin can he'd salvaged, dropped the lobster in, and watched it turn bright red. The meat was the sweetest thing he'd tasted in months. He cried a little while he ate, not from sadness exactly, but from the sudden memory of his mother boiling lobsters on the stove back home. The kitchen windows steamed, her humming an old hymn. The cave itself was changing. Eli had begun to make it his. He gathered armloads of dry kelp and spread it in the back corner for a bed, soft, springy, better than bare sand. He built a low stone wall near the entrance to cut the wind. He even started a small kitchen area, flat rocks for cooking, a driftwood shelf for storing dried mussels and fish. His mother's guidebook stayed open on the shelf, pages weighted with pebbles so the wind wouldn't turn them. He talked to the book sometimes. "Ma, what's this one called again? The purple one with the bumpy shell." He traced the sketch with his finger, memorizing the names. Periwinkle, dog whelk, sea urchin. Knowing their names made them less strange, less frightening. They became neighbors instead of threats. Christmas came and went without fanfare. Eli didn't know the exact date. He'd lost track of Sundays, but he felt the absence. Back home there would have been a small fir tree cut from the woods behind the church, candles in the windows, carols drifting over the snow. Here, he marked the day by giving himself a gift. He climbed to the highest boulder above the cave and watched the sun set into a band of rose and gold. No one else saw it. It was his alone. Then the January thaw came, false and cruel. For 3 days the temperature climbed, the ice melted, and the fish moved closer to shore. Eli caught 3 cunners in one afternoon. He smoked 2 of them over a slow fire of green cedar, the smoke thick and fragrant, preserving them for the next cold snap. He felt almost proud, almost safe. But the sea doesn't let you get comfortable. Late one night, a nor'easter slammed the coast. The wind screamed through the cave mouth like a living animal. Eli had to pile every loose rock he could carry against the entrance, leaving only a small vent for smoke. The tide rose higher than he'd ever seen, waves exploding against the boulders below, spray reaching the cave floor. Water seeped in through cracks he hadn't noticed, cold and black. He moved his bed higher, wrapped himself in every layer he owned, and sat with his back against the wall, listening. The storm lasted 36 hours. When it finally eased, the world outside was scoured clean. Half the mussel beds were torn away, rocks tumbled into new positions, driftwood piled in tangled heaps. Eli stepped out into the pale morning light and felt something shift inside him, not despair. Exactly, but a kind of grim acceptance. The sea would keep testing him. He would keep answering. He spent the next week rebuilding. He gathered fresh kelp for bedding, restacked his wood pile, repaired the stone wall. He even started carving a small wooden spoon from a piece of drift cedar. Using his knife and endless patience, the spoon was crooked. But it was his dot one morning in late January as he was checking his hand line. He heard something he hadn't heard in months. A human voice. It came from the water, faint but unmistakable. Ahoy, anyone there? Eli froze. His first instinct was to hide. The town had cast him out. Strangers could mean trouble, but the voice sounded young, uncertain. He crept to the edge of the boulders and peered down. A small dory bobbed in the shallows. Two boys about his age pulling it along the rocks. One wore a red knit cap. The other had a coat too big for him. They were lobster fishermen's sons. Eli recognized the older one, Caleb Harlow, the selectman's nephew. Caleb cupped his hands. We saw smoke yesterday. Thought maybe a boat. Wrecked. You all right up there? Eli stayed silent for a long moment. Then he stepped into view. Caleb squinted up. Eli Marsh. The name sounded strange in someone else's mouth after so long. Yeah. Eli called back. His voice cracked from disuse. The boys looked at each other. The younger one whispered something. Caleb nodded slowly. We ain't supposed to talk to you, he said. Town rules. But we won't tell if you won't. Eli didn't know what to say. He just nodded. Caleb reached into the bottom of the dory and pulled out a small burlap sack. Pa don't know I took these. Couple of potatoes, a turnip, some salt pork ends. Don't need 'em back. He tossed the sack up onto the rocks. It landed with a soft thud. Eli stared at it, his throat closed. Why, he managed. Caleb shrugged. Ma says nobody should starve in winter. Not even. They didn't wait for thanks. The boys pulled away, disappearing into the fog that was already rolling back in. Eli carried the sack inside like it was made of glass. He sat on his kelp bed and opened it slowly. The smell of the potatoes, earthy, real nearly undid him. He pressed his face into the burlap and let the tears come, hot and silent. For the first time since the banishment, he didn't feel completely alone. Spring arrived the way it always does on the Maine coast, hesitant, then all at once. One morning in late March, the wind shifted south, carrying the faint smell of pine sap and wet earth instead of salt and ice. The ice floes that had choked the harbor cracked and drifted away. Eli woke to the sound of gulls screaming overhead, louder and hungrier than they'd been all winter. He stepped to the cave mouth and saw the water sparkling blue for the first time in months, not the dull steel gray he'd grown used to. His body had changed. The boy who'd been banished was gone. In his place stood someone leaner, harder, with calluses thick as leather on his palms and the beginnings of a beard shadowing his jaw. He was taller too, though he had no mirror to confirm it. Just the way his old coat sleeves now ended well above his wrists. He moved differently now, quieter, more deliberate. The sea had taught him patience the way only hunger and cold can. The mussel beds had begun to recover, new spots settling on the rocks like black pepper. Eli harvested sparingly, always leaving clusters intact. He'd started a small garden of sorts on a sunny ledge above the cave mouth. The soil was thin, mostly crushed shells and seaweed, but he'd carried up handfuls of rich black earth from a protected hollow farther inland during low tides. Into it he planted wild onion bulbs he'd dug up, dandelion roots, and a few potato eyes he'd saved from Caleb's gift back in January. They were small miracles, these green shoots pushing through the gravel. Every morning he checked them first, whispering encouragement the way his mother used to speak to her houseplants. Fish came easier now. The spring run of herring filled the shallows. Silver flashes under the surface. Eli fashioned a better net from unraveled rope and old sailcloth scraps he'd scavenged after a wreck washed up 2 miles down the coast. He waded out at dawn, waist deep in the cold, and swept the net in slow arcs. The first haul was 20 fish, fat and bright-eyed. He cleaned them on the rocks, filleted the meat, and hung strips to dry in the sun and wind. The dried herring tasted smoky and salty. It kept for weeks. He stored it in kelp packets tied with twisted grass. But the real change came with the lobsters. They appeared with the warmer water crawling out of deep crevices to shed their old shells. Eli watched them for days before he acted. He remembered his father's stories about the old wooden traps, but he had no wood to spare and no rope long enough. Instead, he built what he called ghost traps, simple stone cairns with one narrow entrance, baited with fish heads. The lobsters crawled in, then couldn't find their way out. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. His first catch was a keeper, easily 2 pounds. Claws banded with kelp to keep them from fighting. He boiled it in a tide pool warmed by the sun, cracked the shell with a rock, and ate the meat slowly, savoring the sweet brininess. For a moment he closed his eyes and pretended he was back at the kitchen table, his parents laughing over cracked claws and drawn butter. He started keeping a tally on the cave wall, not just days anymore, but catches, weather, moon phases. The charcoal marks grew into patterns he could read like a map of his own survival. Under each full moon he added a small sketch, a fish, a lobster claw, a sprig of green. It was his way of saying, "I'm still here, I'm still learning." Then came the visitors. They started as shadows on the horizon, small boats working the outer ledges, fishermen who'd never fished this far north before the town's runs failed. Word had spread, the way it does in small places. The fish were returning, but only in certain spots. The cove below Eli's cave was one of them. One morning he woke to the sound of oarlocks and low voices. He stayed hidden at first, watching from the cave mouth. 2 dories, 4 men. They set traps close to the rocks, too close. One of them, a weary man with a red beard, glanced up toward the cave and pointed. Eli felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't spoken to anyone since Caleb and his friend back in winter. The thought of confrontation made his hands shake. By afternoon the men were gone, but they returned the next day, and the next. On the 4th morning, Eli decided he couldn't hide forever. He waited until they were close, then stepped out onto the ledge in full view. The red-bearded man, later Eli learned his name was Amos, was hauling a trap when he saw the boy. He froze, then cupped his hand. "You the Marsh kid?" Eli nodded once. Amos looked at the others. One muttered something Eli couldn't hear. Amos spat over the side. "Town said you was gone, dead." "Some reckoned, not dead," Eli called back. His voice was stronger now, carrying over the water. Amos studied him for a long minute. Then he laughed, short and rough. "Guess the sea didn't want you either. They didn't come closer. But they didn't leave either. They worked their traps," and Eli watched. By the end of the week he noticed something. They were losing gear. Lines parted, traps drifted. One morning Amos cursed loud enough to carry when he pulled up an empty warp, his buoy gone. Rope cut clean. Eli knew why. The ledge was treacherous at high tide. Underwater rocks had sharp edges. He'd learned them the hard way. He also knew a better spot 20 yards west, where the bottom was sand and the current gentler. He waited until dusk, when the men had left. Then he swam out cold shock of water. But he was used to it now, found the spot, and marked it with a floating kelp bundle tied to a stone. The next morning he waited on the ledge. Amos's dory came first. He saw the kelp marker, hesitated, then rowed over. When he pulled his first trap from the new spot, it was heavy with lobsters. He looked up at Eli. "This you're doing?" Eli shrugged. "Better holding ground." Amos stared at him. Then he reached into his dory, pulled out a coil of old rope, good hemp, not too weathered, and a small iron grappling hook. "Trade," he said, tossing them up onto the rocks. "For this spot, and maybe you keep showing us when the tide's right." Eli caught the rope. It was heavy, useful. He could make better nets, better traps. He nodded. "Deal." From then on, the fishermen came regularly. They never climbed the rocks to the cave. Town rules still hung over everything, but they left things at the base. A tin of lard, a sack of cornmeal. Once even a wool sweater that had belonged to Amos's son before he outgrew it. Eli took what he needed, left. The rest in a crevice for whoever came next. He never asked for anything. He just pointed out the good spots, warned them about the rip current that ran north on the ebb, showed them where the rock crabs hid under the ledges. They started calling him Cave Boy. Not cruelly, more like a title. One evening in May, as the sun hung low and gold, Amos lingered after the others left. He sat in his dory, rocking gently. Town's talking again. He said, "Fish are back. Some say the curse is lifted. Others say it's because you're not there anymore." Eli sat on a boulder, knees drawn up. "Which do you think?" Amos shrugged. "I think the fish don't care about votes or curses. They care about water temperature and bait. But people need stories." He paused. "You ever think of coming back?" Eli looked out at the water, flat as glass now, reflecting the last light. "No," he said quietly. "This is home." Amos nodded, like he'd expected that answer. He pushed off with an oar. "Fair enough, Cave Boy, keep the rope." As the dory disappeared into the twilight, Eli felt something loosen inside him, not grief, not loneliness, but the last knot of anger he'd carried since the town hall. He didn't forgive them, he just didn't need their forgiveness anymore. He went back inside, lit the fire, and opened his mother's guidebook to a blank page at the end. With the charred end of a stick, he began to draw the cave mouth, the ledge, the water below. A small figure standing on the rocks, looking out, not running, not hiding. Just there. Summer unfolded slow and golden over the coast. The kind of season that makes you forget winter ever existed until the first cold night reminds you. By July, the water had warmed enough that Eli could swim out to the deeper ledges without his teeth chattering. He spent hours floating on his back, staring up at gulls wheeling against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The cave no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like the center of his world. He had become expert at reading the sea now. He knew when the mackerel would run thick near the surface. Silver schools flashing like coins tossed into sunlight. He knew the exact hour the tide turned and pulled the lobster out of their deep holes toward shallower water. He knew which winds brought fog and which brought clear days, perfect for drying fish. His hands were brown and scarred, knuckles permanently scraped from barnacles, fingernails cracked from prying mussels, but they were steady. His garden had grown wilder. The potato plants sprawled across the ledge, green leaves broad and healthy, small white flowers promising tubers by fall. Wild carrots, queen, and lace had volunteered themselves from seeds carried on the wind. He harvested the tender roots, boiled them soft, and mashed them with roasted fish for a meal that almost tasted like civilization. Dandelions bloomed everywhere. He ate the young leaves raw, bitter but full of life. Once he even found a patch of beach peas clinging to the rocks, their purple flowers bright against the granite. He picked the pods carefully, saving some to replant next spring. The fishermen came almost daily now. Amos and his crew had claimed the cove as their own ground, and word had spread quietly along the coast. Other boats appeared strangers at first, then men who nodded at Eli like he was part of the landscape. They left offerings at the base of the rocks, a jar of molasses, a pair of patched mittens, a tin of hardtack. One day someone left a small iron frying pan, dented but solid. Eli nearly wept when he saw it. He scrubbed it with sand and seawater until it gleamed, then used it to fry cutter fillets in a little seal flat Amos had traded him. The sizzle filled the cave with a smell so rich it made his mouth water before the first bite. He began to trade more deliberately. He left baskets woven from beach grass at the water's edge filled with smoked herring, dry kelp for soup stock, or handfuls of sea urchin roe when the spiny green globes were full. The men took what they wanted and left something in return. It wasn't charity anymore. It was commerce, quiet and unspoken. Eli liked it that way. No one asked questions. No one mentioned the town vote. They just nodded, pushed off, and came back the next week. But the sea is never content to let things stay easy. In late August, a hurricane brewed far to the south. The sky turned an odd bruised color, the air thick and still. Gulls vanished. The water went flat, glassy, waiting. Eli felt it in his bones, the pressure drop, the way the birds stopped calling. He spent 2 days preparing. He moved his stores higher into the cave, lashed his few possessions to rocks with new rope, piled extra driftwood inside. He even built a low wall of stones across the entrance, leaving only a crawl space at the top for air. When the storm hit, it came fast. The wind rose in the night, howling through the cave mouth like 1,000 voices. Rain lashed sideways, stinging even inside. Waves climbed the boulders, higher than Eli had ever seen, exploding against the rock face in white fury. The tide surged in, black water rushing across the cave floor, cold and fast. Eli climbed to the highest ledge, pressed his back against the stone, and held on. The cave shook. Rocks rattled loose from the ceiling, small stones pattering down like hail. Water climbed to his knees, then his waist. He tasted salt on his lips, felt the current tugging at his legs. For the first time since the banishment, he felt real fear, not the slow, grinding fear of hunger, but sharp, immediate terror. The sea wanted him. It had waited years, and now it was reaching. He thought of his mother then, not her sickness, not her last days, but the way she used to stand on the porch during storms, arms crossed, watching the waves like they were old neighbors who'd come calling too often. "It'll blow itself out," she'd say. "Always does." Eli clung to that. He didn't pray. He hadn't prayed since the town hall, but he spoke to her out loud, voice lost in the roar. "You were right, Ma. It'll blow itself out." The night stretched forever. Water rose to his chest. Then, slowly, impossibly, it began to drop. The wind eased from scream to moan to sigh. By dawn, the rain had softened to drizzle. The tide pulled back, leaving the cave floor slick and strewn with seaweed, broken shells, and one small lobster still alive, waving a claw like it was surprised to be there. Eli stepped outside into gray light. The world had been rearranged. Boulders shifted, trees along the shore bent or snapped. Driftwood lay everywhere, enough to keep his fire going for months. The ledge garden was gone, washed clean, but the potato plants higher up had survived. Leaves torn, but roots holding. He laughed, a raw, hoarse sound. He was alive, again. The fishermen came 3 days later, boats battered but whole. Amos rowed close, face lined with exhaustion. "Thought we'd find the cave empty," he called up. "Or you gone?" Eli stood on the ledge, dripping wet, smiling for the first time in days. "Still here." Amos shook his head. "Stubborn as your old man." They left more than usual that day. A wool blanket, a sack of flour, a small iron pot with a lid, and something else, a folded piece of paper, sealed with a drop of candle wax. Eli waited until they were gone before he opened it. The handwriting was careful, the ink a little smudged. "Eli, the town's talking different now. Fish are thick again. Winters aren't as hard. Some say the curse was never you, it was us being afraid. No one's saying come home. Not yet, but if you ever want to walk the harbor path again, there'll be a light in the window of the old Perkins place. Mrs. Perkins keeps it burning. You're not forgotten." Caleb Eli read it twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it inside his mother's guidebook between the pages of pressed seaweed. He didn't cry. He just sat on the ledge and watched the water settle back into its usual rhythm. The sun broke through at last, turning the waves to liquid gold. He picked up a piece of driftwood, began carving again. This time not a spoon, a small boat. No, bigger than his hand, rough at first, but the lines grew cleaner as he worked. When it was done, he carried it down to the water's edge, set it on a flat rock, and pushed it gently into the outgoing tide. It floated away, steady and small, carried by the current he had learned to trust. He watched until it was just a speck, then turned back to the cave. There was work to do. The garden needed replanting. The nets needed mending. Winter would come again, sooner than he wanted, but he was ready. And for the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Fall painted the coast in fire and rust. The maples along the inland ridges turned scarlet, their leaves drifting down like slow-burning embers. The water cooled again. taking on that deep, slate blue color that meant winter was sharpening its knives somewhere out in the Atlantic. Eli felt the change in his marrow, the way his breath fogged longer in the mornings, the way the fish moved deeper, the way the gulls cried with a sharper edge. He was 17 now, or near enough. He'd stopped counting birthdays the way most people do. Time here was measured in tides, in the slow growth of his beard, in the way his shoulders had broadened from hauling rocks and nets. The cave had become more than shelter. It was a house, lived in and loved in its rough way. The walls bore his marks, tallies of storms survived, sketches of lobsters and herring. Even a rough map of the cove with X marking the best trap spots. His mother's guidebook lay open on its driftwood shelf, pages worn soft from years of turning, corners curled from salt air. He still talked to it sometimes, still traced her handwriting as if he could pull her voice back from the paper. The fisherman had become a kind of family, distant, practical. Bound by the sea more than blood, Amos came most often, his red beard gone mostly gray now. He brought news in small doses, never pushing, never preaching. Towns rebuilt the dock after that last nor'easter, he'd say. Or Caleb's got himself a girl, works at the cannery. Eli listened, nodded, asked few questions. He didn't need to know everything. Knowing too much might make him want things he'd learned to live without. One crisp October morning, Amos rode in alone. No crew, no traps, just him and a small wooden crate in the bow of the dory. He tied off on a barnacle-crested rock and climbed up to the ledge where Eli waited. "Got something for you," Amos said, voice rougher than usual. He lifted the crate and set it between them. Eli looked down. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a small brass spyglass, sold but cared for. Lenses clear. Beside it was a folded letter, sealed with the same red wax as before. From Mrs. Perkins, Amos said. She said if you ever wanted to look back at the harbor, this might help. And the letter, well, read it when you're ready. Eli took the spyglass first. It was heavier than it looked, cool metal against his palm. He extended it, put it to his eye, and aimed toward the south where the town lay hidden behind a point of land. At first it was just blur, then focus. The white steeple of the church, the red roof of the general store, the long curve of the harbor with boats rocking at their moorings. Smoke rose thin from chimneys. People moved on the dock like small dark figures in a painting. He lowered the glass slowly. His throat felt tight. Amos cleared his throat. She also said, "If you ever decide the cave's done teaching you, there's a place at the boatyard. Old man Harlow's getting too stiff to swing a hammer. Could use a hand who knows the water like you do." Eli looked at him. "They'd have me back." Amos shrugged. "Some would, some wouldn't, but the ones who matter, they've changed their minds, or at least their mouths. The fish came back strong after you left. People started saying maybe the curse was their fear, not your blood. Takes time for folks to admit they were wrong, but time's passed." Eli didn't answer right away. He turned the spyglass in his hands, feeling the weight of possibility. "I'll think on it," he said finally. Amos nodded, no pressure in it. "Fair enough. I'll be by next week. If you want to send a message back, you know where to find me." He climbed down, pushed off, and rode away without looking back. Eli sat on the ledge until the dory was gone. Then he opened the letter. It was short, written in a careful hand that trembled just a little. "Eli, I kept your father's chair by the window all these years. The house is still yours if you want it. No one's touched it but me. Dusted, aired it out, kept the mice away. You don't have to come. But if the sea ever tells you it's time, come home quiet like. No one will make a fuss. We've all got our own ghosts to quiet. There's always a lamp burning." Perkins, he folded the paper, tucked it with the others in the guidebook. Then he lifted the spyglass again and looked south one more time. The harbor looked smaller than he remembered, fragile almost, clinging to the rocks the way he once had. He spent the rest of the fall thinking. He fished, he foraged, he repaired nets and rebuilt the stone wall the last storm had cracked. He carved another small boat, this one with a tiny figure standing in the bow, looking forward instead of backhand, set it adrift on a high tide. Each day the pull of the town grew quieter, not stronger. The cave had given him everything: food, shelter, strength, understanding. It had taught him he could stand alone and still stand tall. Winter came early that year, the first snow dusting. The rocks before Thanksgiving. Eli woke one morning to find the world white and silent. He stepped outside, breath clouding, and looked south. No boats today, the wind was too raw. He went back inside, built the fire high, and sat with his mother's book open to the last page. He took a fresh piece of charcoal and began to draw one final sketch: the cave mouth seen from the water. A small figure standing on the ledge, hand raised not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. Then, beneath it, in small careful letters, "Thank you." He closed the book, set it on the shelf, and stepped outside again. The snow had stopped. Sunlight broke through, turning the flakes to diamonds. He picked up the spyglass, looked once more toward the harbor, then lowered it and pointed it north instead, toward the empty, open sea where no one lived and no one judged. He smiled, small and real. The cave had been his home when he needed one most. Now he carried home inside him. If he ever walked the harbor path again, it wouldn't be because he had to. It would be because he chose to. And that choice felt like freedom. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of pine and distant wood smoke. Eli turned back inside to stoke the fire. There were traps to check, fish to smoke, another winter to meet. Head dash on. He was ready. And wherever the tide took him next, he'd go with open eyes. If you've made it this far through Ali's story, the banishment, the loneliness, the slow building of a life for nothing, thank you. Stories like this remind us how strong one person can be when the world turns its back. If Ellie's journey moved you, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one, because there are more tales of quiet courage, forgotten corners, and people who turn exile into something unbreakable. Drop a like if you felt that ending in your chest, and maybe share this with someone who needs to hear that home isn't always a place, it's sometimes just the strength to keep going. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next story.